The bear pit was built for death. For 200 years, Alpha Krell's pack had thrown the unworthy into that stone arena with 5 starving bears. No one survived. The bones proved it. When Zyla failed to shift during her coming-of-age ceremony, her own father sentenced her without hesitation. She'd always been his shame, born mute, delicate, with silver-white hair and ice-blue eyes that looked nothing like his brutal strength. A ghost child in a pack that valued dominance and the ability to command through voice. The pack gathered at dawn to watch her die. Zyla didn't fight as they dragged her to the pit's edge. Fighting had never helped before. The bears were released, savage with deliberate hunger. The crowd waited for screaming. Instead, the largest bear approached Zyla's trembling form, sniffed once, and lay down beside her. The others followed, forming a protective circle around her fragile body through the freezing night. They chose starvation over violence. By morning, Bram, the low-ranking Omega groundskeeper who'd loved her from the shadows, heard something impossible. "She is chosen. She is pure. We will not harm the listener." The bears were speaking, and somehow, miraculously, he could understand every word. Zyla had learned early that silence was survival. Not that she'd had a choice. She'd been born without a voice, born wrong in a pack that measured worth in dominance and the ability to command through words. But over 16 years, she'd perfected the art of making herself small, invisible, unworthy of her father's attention. It rarely worked. Alpha Krell was a mountain of a man, all brutal strength and scarred flesh, with eyes like winter storms and a temperament to match. He'd built his reputation on ruthlessness, on the kind of leadership that demanded absolute submission. His mate had died bringing Zyla into the world, and he'd never forgiven his daughter for it. "You are my greatest shame," he'd told her on her 10th birthday, loud enough for the entire pack hall to hear. "A mute wolf is no wolf at all. You should have died with your mother." Zyla had stood there, silver-white hair falling around her face like a shroud, ice-blue eyes fixed on the ground, and absorbed the words like she absorbed everything else. Silently, what else could she do? The other pack children learned quickly to echo their alpha's disdain. They called her ghost, broken thing, the silent freak. The kinder ones simply pretended she didn't exist. Zyla preferred the latter. Invisibility was a gift when your father looked at you with barely concealed disgust. She'd tried, in her own way, to prove her worth. She learned to read faster than anyone her age, devoured every book in the pack's library. She helped the healers, her gentle hands and patient presence a comfort to the injured. She could track better than wolves twice her age, read the forest like a language only she understood. None of it mattered. She couldn't speak. She couldn't command. And in Krell's pack, that made her worthless. The coming-of-age ceremony was held on the spring equinox, when young wolves turned 16 and proved their worth by shifting for the first time. It was sacred, ancient, the moment when childhood ended and pack membership truly began. Failure was almost unheard of. Almost. The ceremony ground was a massive clearing ringed by torches, the entire pack gathered in a circle. 7 young wolves stood in the center, hearts racing with anticipation and fear. Zyla was the last in line, and she could feel her father's eyes boring into her back like hot coals. One by one, the others shifted. Bones cracked and reformed, fur erupted, and wolves emerged, some clumsy, some graceful, but all successful. The pack howled their approval each time. Then it was Zyla's turn. She stepped into the center of the circle, feeling 300 pairs of eyes on her delicate frame. Her silver hair caught the torchlight, making her look even more ethereal, even more unlike the powerful warriors surrounding her. She closed her eyes and reached for that place inside herself where the wolf should be, where instinct and power should be waiting. Nothing. She tried again, harder this time, desperate. Felt for the transformation, the connection to her beast, the primal magic that should be her birthright. Nothing. Minutes passed. The silence grew heavy. Whispers started rippling through the crowd. "Concentrate," someone called out. It might have been meant kindly, but it landed like a stone. Zyla's hands were shaking now. Sweat beaded on her forehead. She reached deeper, clawed at the emptiness inside herself, begged the universe for just this one thing, this one proof that she belonged. Enough. Krell's voice cut through the clearing like a blade. He strode into the circle, his massive form radiating fury and something that might have been vindication. He'd been waiting for this, Zyla realized with sinking horror, hopping for it. "She cannot shift because she is not one of us," Krell announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathering. "I have tolerated this, creature out of obligation to her mother's memory, but a wolf who cannot shift is no wolf at all. She is broken, defective, and our pack does not shelter the weak." "Alpha, perhaps more time," one of the elders began. Silence. Krell didn't even look at the old wolf. His eyes were fixed on Zyla, and they were empty of anything resembling mercy. "She is no child of mine. She has shamed this pack for the last time." Zyla couldn't speak to defend herself, couldn't argue or beg or explain the emptiness where her wolf should be. She could only stand there, small and silver-haired and utterly alone, while her father condemned her. "The bear pit," Krell said simply, "at dawn." The crowd erupted, some voices raised in protest, others in agreement, but most in shock. The bear pit was reserved for traitors, for oath-breakers, for crimes so heinous that death was the only answer, not for a girl who simply couldn't shift. But Krell's word was law. It had always been law. The beta wolves moved forward to take Zyla's arms. She didn't resist as they led her away from the ceremonial ground, away from the pack she'd never truly belonged to, toward the stone cells beneath the pack house where condemned wolves spent their final hours. From the shadows at the edge of the clearing, Bram watched with a breaking heart. He was nothing, a low-ranking Omega, a groundskeeper whose hands were better with soil than with weapons, invisible in the way Omegas always were. He'd loved Zyla for years in the quiet, desperate way of someone who knows they'll never be worthy of speaking that love aloud. He'd seen her gentleness with injured animals, her patience with the younger pups who didn't know yet to be cruel. He'd seen her reading in the library, silver hair falling like water over ancient texts, and thought she looked like something from a different world entirely, something better than this one. Now he watched them lock her in stone and darkness to wait for death, and he was powerless to stop it. The cell was small, cold, carved from the same ancient stone as the bear pit itself. Zyla sat on the narrow bench and pulled her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. She wasn't crying. Tears required hope, and she'd spent that currency long ago. At dawn, they would throw her to the bears. She would die screaming, because even mute girls could scream. Her father would finally be rid of his shame, and the pack would forget she'd ever existed. Zyla closed her eyes and waited for morning. Dawn came too quickly and not quickly enough. Zyla heard the cell door open, heard the heavy footsteps of warriors who wouldn't meet her eyes. They hauled her up by her arms, not gentle but not unnecessarily cruel either, just doing their duty, just following their alpha's orders. The walk to the bear pit felt both endless and instantaneous. Through corridors of stone, upstairs worn smooth by centuries of condemned feet, out into the cold morning air where the entire pack waited. The pit was ancient, a circular arena carved into the earth and lined with massive stone blocks. Torches ringed the upper edge, their flames pale in the dawn light. The pack stood 3 deep around the perimeter, hundreds of wolves gathered to witness justice, or murder depending on your perspective. Zyla's legs nearly gave out when she saw it. The pit was deeper than she'd imagined, perhaps 20 feet down to the sand-covered floor. The stone walls were smooth, unclimbable, stained dark with old blood that no amount of rain could wash away. Around the edges at ground level were 5 iron cages, and inside those cages were the bears. They were massive, each one easily twice the size of a wolf in shifted form. Deliberate starvation had made them lean and vicious, their ribs visible beneath mangy fur, their eyes wild with hunger and rage. Scars covered their bodies, marks from fights with each other, from fights with previous victims, from the cruelty required to keep them savage enough for their purpose. The largest was a female, her muzzle graying but her eyes sharp with terrible intelligence. She watched Zyla being dragged forward with an intensity that made the girl's blood freeze. Krell stood at the edge of the pit, positioned so the rising sun backlit him dramatically. Always performing, always projecting strength. He raised one massive hand, and the crowd fell silent. For 200 years, this pack has maintained its strength through ruthless honesty, he began, his voice carrying across the arena. We do not tolerate weakness. We do not shelter the broken. When rot threatens the tree, we cut it away before it spreads. His eyes found Zyla, cold and final. This girl carries my blood, but she is not my daughter. She cannot shift. She cannot speak. She cannot contribute to the pack's strength. She is a reminder of everything we have bred out of our bloodline. Fragility, deficiency, failure. Zyla stood between the warriors, silver hair whipping in the cold wind, and felt the weight of 300 stares. Some pitying, most simply accepting. This was pack law. This was how things had always been. Let her death cleanse the weakness from our bloodline, Krell finished. Let it remind us all that strength is not negotiable. The warriors lifted Zyla by her arms and legs. She didn't fight. What would be the point? For a moment she hung suspended above the pit, small and pale and utterly helpless. Then they threw her. The fall seemed to last forever. Wind rushed past her face, her stomach lurched, and then she hit the sand hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Pain exploded through her shoulder and hip. She rolled, gasping, tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue. Above her, she heard the screech of metal on stone as the cage doors were lifted. The bears emerged slowly, deliberately, like nightmares taking physical form. Their claws scraped against stone. Their breath came in harsh, hungry pants. They'd been kept without food for 3 days specifically for this moment, their natural caution overridden by starvation and fury. The pack leaned forward, eager for the spectacle. Some of the younger wolves looked away, but most watched with the clinical interest of predators observing prey. Zyla pushed herself up to sitting, her injured shoulder screaming in protest. There was nowhere to run. The walls were smooth and high. The bears were spreading out, circling her with the practiced efficiency of pack hunters. She was going to die, and it was going to hurt, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. The largest bear, the matriarch, moved forward first. Zyla could smell her, all musk and wild and ancient rage. Massive paws, each as large as Zyla's head, left deep impressions in the sand. The bear's mouth opened slightly, revealing yellow teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. Zyla didn't close her eyes. If she was going to die, she would at least face it. The matriarch reached her, loomed over her, so close that Zyla could feel the heat radiating from her massive body. She lowered her scarred muzzle and sniffed, once, twice, her wet nose nearly touching Zyla's face. Then she lay down. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to every prediction, that the crowd actually gasped. The massive bear simply folded her legs and settled into the sand beside Zyla, her bulk creating a windbreak, her presence somehow protective rather than threatening. The other 4 bears looked at their matriarch, then at Zyla, then one by one they approached. Not with aggression, but with something like curiosity. They sniffed her hair, her hands, her torn clothing. And then, impossibly, they lay down too. They formed a circle around her, their massive bodies pressed close, sharing the warmth of their fur against the cold morning air. The smallest bear, a younger male with a torn ear, positioned himself against Zyla's back, and she felt his steady heartbeat through her thin dress. Above, the silence was absolute. 300 wolves stood frozen in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. Bears didn't do this. Bears didn't protect. They killed. That was their nature, their purpose, the entire reason for the pit's existence. Krell's face had gone purple with rage. Starve them longer, he snarled at the bear keeper. 3 more days, then throw her back in. But he couldn't kill her now, not with the whole pack watching this impossibility. It would look like fear, like weakness. So he turned and stalked away, leaving Zyla alive in a circle of bears who should have torn her apart. As the day wore on and the crowd gradually dispersed, someone threw food into the pit, meat for the bears, their delayed feeding. The bears didn't move. They stayed in their protective circle around Zyla, ignoring the food even as their ribs showed stark beneath their fur, even as hunger must have been clawing at their insides. They were choosing her over survival, and no one, least of all Zyla herself, understood why. Night fell and the temperature dropped viciously. Zyla should have frozen in her thin dress on the cold sand. Instead, the bears pressed closer, their warmth keeping her alive through the darkness. She could feel their breathing, steady and deep, and for the first time in her life she felt protected. At the edge of the pit, Bram kept vigil. He'd arrived as the crowd was leaving, had watched from the shadows as the sun set and the stars emerged. He couldn't leave her, even though there was nothing he could do, even though his presence changed nothing. He sat in the cold grass and watched the bears guard the girl he loved, and wondered what kind of world would call this a miracle while calling her broken. Morning light crept over the edge of the pit, revealing a scene that defied everything the pack thought they knew about nature and savagery. Zyla was alive, curled between the bodies of 5 bears who looked noticeably weaker than they had the day before. Their ribs protruded more sharply, their movements were slower, but their protective circle hadn't wavered through the freezing night. Bram had watched it all from his vigil at the pit's edge, exhaustion pulling at his bones but refusing to let him leave. As groundskeeper, he'd be the one sent to clean up after executions. He'd prepared himself to find pieces, blood, the aftermath of violence. Instead, he found this impossible tableau of girl and beasts sleeping in a circle like packmates. Beta Marcus arrived with the dawn patrol, his expression grim. "Groundskeeper," he called down to Bram. "Alpha's orders. Remove the body and prepare the pit for tonight's execution." "She's alive," Bram said, his voice rough from disuse. "Then retrieve her. She'll be thrown back in after proper starving of the bears. 3 more days without food should correct this aberration." Bram's hands clenched, but he nodded. Orders were orders, especially for an Omega. He made his way to the pit's maintenance entrance, a narrow tunnel that led to a reinforced door at ground level. It was designed for removing remains, for cleaning between executions, for the grim maintenance that no one else wanted to acknowledge. His heart hammered as he unlocked the door and stepped into the arena. The bears' heads lifted immediately, eyes fixing on him with predatory focus. The matriarch rose to her feet, placing herself between Bram and Zyla, and released a low warning growl that vibrated through his chest. "I'm not here to hurt her," Bram said softly, raising his empty hands. "I promise, I just need to." "Do not fear, Omega. She is safe with us." Bram froze. The voice was deep, resonant, distinctly feminine, and it had come from the matriarch. But the bear's mouth hadn't moved. The words had simply appeared in his mind, clear as speech but somehow deeper, more fundamental. His voice cracked. "Did you just—" "You hear us?" The matriarch's massive head tilted, eyes widening with something like wonder. "Another one. After so long, another one." "I don't understand." Bram's legs felt weak. He'd heard stories of wolves going mad from isolation, from trauma, hearing voices that weren't there. But this felt different. Real. "You are listener, like she is." The matriarch settled back onto her haunches, her aggression fatting into something gentler. "Though your gift is newer, Rower, you have not learned to hear properly yet." Zyla stirred at the sound of voices, her ice-blue eyes opening slowly. She looked at Bram with a mixture of confusion and hope, then at the bears surrounding her, then back to Bram as if trying to understand why he was here, whether this was rescue or another form of execution. "What's a listener?" Bram asked, moving closer slowly. The other bears watched but didn't threaten. "Ancient gift." Old magic from before packs became obsessed with dominance and voice. The matriarch's tone carried weight, history. Listeners hear the voices of earth and animal. They speak without words. They understand what others dismiss as instinct or silence. She is listener, pure of heart, first in 5 generations. "That's why she can't shift," Bram breathed, understanding dawning. "She's not broken, she's something else entirely." "Not broken, never broken." The bear's emphasis was fierce. "She is what your kind used to honor before fear made them hunt us down. before alphas decided only their voices mattered. Bram knelt beside Zyla, whose silver hair was matted with sand and whose lips had a blue tinge from cold. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. She tried, but her legs buckled. Hypothermia and shock had stolen her strength. Bram caught her, lifting her carefully into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, all delicate bones and fragile determination. "Protect her," the matriarch commanded. "They will try again. The alpha fears what he cannot control." "I will," Bram promised, though he had no idea how an Omega groundskeeper could protect anyone from an alpha's wrath. He carried Zyla through the tunnel and emerged into morning light just as Krell arrived, flanked by his most loyal warriors. The alpha's face was thunderous when he saw Zyla alive in Bram's arms. "What is the meaning of this?" Krell demanded. "She survived Alpha." Bram kept his voice carefully neutral, his eyes lowered in appropriate submission. "The bears didn't attack." "I can see that," Krell's jaw clenched. "It's a fluke, animal confusion, it means nothing." But the gathered wolves were whispering. Some looked at Zyla with new curiosity, others with suspicion, but none with the casual dismissal they'd shown before. A girl surviving the bear pit wasn't nothing. It was unprecedented. It was either miracle or witchcraft, and neither fit the neat categories Krell had built his leadership on. "Tonight," Krell announced loudly, playing to the crowd. "We'll try again after properly preparing the bears." This was clearly a failure of protocol. "Alpha, perhaps," Beta Marcus began carefully. "Tonight," Krell repeated, his tone allowing no argument. "The groundskeeper will return her to her cell. The bears will be starved properly, and this aberration will be corrected." He swept away, leaving Bram holding Zyla and trying not to show his fear. The girl in his arms was shaking, whether from cold or terror he couldn't tell. Her ice-blue eyes met his, and in them he saw understanding. She knew she was going back. She knew the bears might not protect her a second time. "Come on," Bram murmured. "Let's get you warm first." He carried her toward the pack house, taking the servants' entrance to avoid curious stares. Her cell was in the lower level, cold stone designed for punishment rather than comfort. But Bram had access to the entire compound as groundskeeper, including places no one paid attention to. He made a decision that would either save her or doom them both. Instead of returning her to the cell, he turned down a different corridor, toward the small cottage at the edge of the grounds where he lived in the isolation appropriate for his rank. It was forbidden to harbor condemned prisoners, but it was also forbidden to execute someone who might be touched by the old magic, and apparently no one cared about that law anymore. Zyla's hand gripped his shirt as he pushed open his door, her fingers cold but strong. When he looked down at her, she wasn't afraid. She was watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch, as if she could see straight through to his desperate, foolish heart. "You understand," he whispered, not a question. She nodded once, her eyes never leaving his face, and somehow, without words, he knew she'd heard everything. The bears' voices, his promise to protect her, the truth he'd been too afraid to speak aloud. She understood because she was a listener, and now, impossibly, so was he. The cottage was small, barely more than 2 rooms and a fireplace, but it was warm and private and blessedly far from the pack house's watchful eyes. Bram laid Zyla on his narrow bed and immediately set about building up the fire, coaxing flames from embers until heat began pushing back the cold. She watched him move through the space with the quiet efficiency of someone used to being invisible, used to serving without being seen. He filled a pot with water from the pump, hung it over the fire to heat, then rummaged through his meager supplies for anything that might help. Clean cloth for bandages. Dried herbs the healer had given him last winter for his own injuries. A blanket that had seen better days but was still whole. "I'm going to check your injuries," he said softly, approaching the bed. "Is that all right?" Zyla nodded, her ice-blue eyes following his every movement. She was still shaking, though whether from cold or delayed shock he couldn't tell. Probably both. Her shoulder was badly bruised from the fall, already purpling. Her hip was scraped raw, but nothing seemed broken, which was a miracle in itself. Bram worked gently, warming water to clean the wounds, his hands steady despite his racing heart. He'd tended injured animals countless times. This shouldn't be different. Except it was. Because this was Zyla, and he'd loved her from a distance for so long that having her here, in his space, felt like a dream he might wake from at any moment. "The bears," he said as he worked, needing to fill the silence. "They spoke to me, in my head like thoughts that weren't mine." He glanced up at her face. "Has that ever happened to you?" Her eyes widened. She nodded vigorously, then pointed to herself, to her ears, then made a gesture that encompassed everything around them. "You hear them all the time," Bram translated. "Not just bears, everything." Another nod. Her hands moved in quick gestures, birds, trees, wind, earth. A whole language of motion that Bram was only beginning to understand. "The matriarch called you a listener. She said it's an ancient gift." He finished bandaging her shoulder and sat back. "She said you're the first in 5 generations." Zyla's expression shifted. Relief, recognition, something that might have been vindication. She touched her throat, then shook her head, made a gesture like speaking, then pointed to her ears instead. "You don't speak with your mouth because you speak with something else," Bram tried to interpret. "Because you're listening instead." She smiled. It was small and tentative, but it transformed her face, made her look less like a ghost and more like the girl she should have been allowed to be. Bram ladled warm broth from the pot he kept simmering, mostly vegetables and scraps, but nourishing enough. Zyla accepted the bowl with both hands and drank slowly, her eyes closing in appreciation of the simple warmth. When was the last time someone had given her food with kindness instead of obligation? "I need to find out more," Bram said after she'd finished eating. "About listeners, about what it means." He stood, moving to the small shelf where he kept his few books. "The pack archives might have something. I can access them as groundskeeper. No one pays attention to where Omegas go." Zyla caught his hand before he could leave, her grip surprisingly strong. She looked at him with an intensity that stole his breath. Then slowly, deliberately, she placed his hand over her heart. He could feel it beating, steady and strong beneath his palm. "I'll come back," he promised. "I swear it, you're safe here." The pack archives were housed in the oldest part of the pack house, a stone chamber that smelled of dust and forgotten things. Bram had been here before. Groundskeepers maintained all areas, even those rarely used, but he'd never paid attention to the contents. Books were for scholars and elders, not for Omegas who worked with their hands. Now he searched with purpose, running his fingers along spines, looking for anything about gifts, about magic, about the old ways before Krell's grandfather had modernized the pack. Most texts were administrative, birth records, territorial agreements, combat logs. But in the back corner, behind a shelf that hadn't been disturbed in years, he found a leather-bound volume that made his pulse quicken. The Lost Arts, a history of gifts the modern pack has forgotten. Bram pulled it down carefully, the leather cracking under his touch. He flipped through pages of cramped handwriting, illustrations of symbols he didn't recognize, until he found a chapter titled Listeners, the speakers without voice. His hands shook as he read. Listeners were once the most sacred members of any pack. Born rarely, perhaps once every few generations, they possessed the ability to hear the voices of all living things, animals, plants, the earth itself. They spoke not with words, but with a deeper form of communication. Understanding, and being understood through intention, and feeling rather than sound. Listeners could not shift into wolf form, for they were not meant to be one thing or another. They were bridges between worlds, mediators between pack and nature. Their presence brought harmony, their counsel was sought above all others, and their wisdom shaped pack law more than any alpha's command. Bram read faster, his heart sinking with each paragraph. As packs grew larger and more militaristic, listeners became inconvenient. They advocated for peace over conquest, for listening over commanding. Alphas who craved absolute power found them threatening. How could one rule through dominance when a listener could reveal the truth beneath every word, every action? 300 years ago, the Great Purge began. Listeners were declared unnatural, dangerous, corrupted by dark magic. They were hunted systematically, executed under various pretenses. Those who survived went into hiding or suppressed their gifts so thoroughly that the ability eventually died out. The last recorded listener was Mara Silvertongue, executed 200 years ago for consorting with beasts against pack interests. In truth, she had tried to prevent a territorial war by revealing that the disputed land was sacred ground where the spirits still dwelt. The Alpha at the time declared her a traitor and had her burned. Bram's eyes stung. 200 years, 5 generations. And now Zyla, born into a pack led by an Alpha who valued dominance above all else, who saw her gift as defect and her silence as shame. He kept reading, learning that listeners' muteness wasn't inability but choice, or rather, evolution. They heard so much that speaking felt crude, unnecessary. Their minds worked differently, processing layers of communication that those who relied on speech couldn't access. They didn't fail to shift because they were weak, but because they were something older than wolves, something that predated the need to choose between human and beast. They were both and neither. They were the in-between. "She's not broken," Bram whispered to the empty archive room. "She never was." He copied what he could, his handwriting cramped and hurried, then returned the book to its dusty corner. By the time he made his way back to the cottage, the sun was high and his mind was racing with implications. Zyla was awake, sitting by the fire wrapped in his blanket. She looked up when he entered, hope and fear warring in her expression. "I found it," Bram said, kneeling beside her. "I found out what you are." He showed her his notes, reading aloud the passages about listeners, about their sacred role, about how they'd been systematically destroyed by alphas who feared their truth-telling. Tears slipped down Zyla's cheeks as she listened. Not tears of sadness, but of recognition. Of finally being seen for what she was instead of what she couldn't do. "You're not meant to be a wolf," Bram said gently. "You're meant to be something more, something they tried to erase from the world because you threatened their power." He took her hands. "Krell knows, maybe not consciously, but some part of him recognizes what you are. That's why he wants you dead. Not because you're weak, but because you're dangerous to everything he's built his authority on." Zyla nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the words on Bram's copied pages. Then she looked up at him and placed her hand over his heart, mirroring what she'd done before. "What is it?" Bram asked. She took his hand and placed it over her own heart, then pointed to him, to herself, then to his ears. "I'm a listener too," Bram's voice cracked. "But I'm nobody, I'm just an Omega. I've never heard anything before yesterday." Zyla shook her head firmly. She pointed to his heart again, then to his ears, then made a gesture like something sleeping and waking. "It was dormant," Bram breathed. "And you woke it up. When I was near you, when I was trying to help you, it activated." He laughed, slightly hysterical. "We're both listeners, the first 2 in 200 years." She smiled, really smiled, and it was like dawn breaking. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked happy. Not just less miserable, but genuinely, radiantly happy. Because she wasn't alone anymore. They waited until the pack house was dark and still, until even the night sentries had settled into their patrol patterns. Bram knew every shadow in the compound, every blind spot created by torchlight, every path the guards ignored because groundskeepers weren't worth watching. He'd spent his entire life being invisible. Tonight, that invisibility might save them both. He led Zyla through the servants' gate, past the storage sheds, into the forest that bordered the eastern edge of Packlands. She moved like a ghost beside him, her silver hair tucked under a dark hood, her steps silent on the pine needle floor. The forest swallowed them, and for the first time in days, Bram felt like he could breathe. "The archive said listeners need to practice," he whispered, though they were far enough from the compound that normal voices wouldn't carry. "That the gift grows stronger with use, like a muscle." Zyla nodded, already moving deeper into the trees. She stopped in a small clearing where moonlight filtered through the canopy, creating patterns of silver and shadow on the forest floor. She closed her eyes, tilted her head slightly, and went completely still. Bram watched, fascinated. Her face transformed. The tension that usually lived in her shoulders melted away. The guardedness in her expression softened into something approaching peace. She looked like she was listening to music he couldn't hear, swaying slightly to a rhythm only she could perceive. Then he heard it, faint at first, like whispers at the edge of consciousness. Stranger in our trees, not hunter, curious, safe. The voice, if it could be called that, had a fluttering quality, rapid and bright. Bram's eyes snapped open and he looked up to find a small bird perched on a branch above them, head cocked, watching with one obsidian eye. I heard that, Bram breathed. I heard the bird. Zyla's eyes opened and she smiled, gesturing for him to try. To really listen, not with his ears but with something deeper, something that existed beneath language and sound. Bram closed his eyes and reached for that space he'd found in the bare pit, that place where the matriarch's voice had been so clear. At first there was nothing but the normal sounds of the forest, wind and leaves, his own heartbeat, Zyla's breathing beside him. Then, gradually, the world began to speak. Cold tonight, need more moss for nest. Brother pushed me out of the good sleeping spot. Rude. Humans below, strange humans, they taste like old magic. Voices layered over each other, some clear and some distant, creating a tapestry of communication he'd never known existed. Squirrels gossiping in the trees, an owl hunting in the distance. Deer moving through the undergrowth, their thoughts calm and focused on finding the tender shoots that grew near the stream. It's beautiful, Bram said, opening his eyes to find Zyla watching him with an expression of such joy it made his chest ache. How did you survive hearing all of this alone? For years. She touched her heart, then made a gesture toward the forest, embracing, encompassing. This was her family, these voices. When humans had rejected her, the natural world had accepted her completely. They spent hours in that clearing, practicing. Zyla showed him how to focus on individual voices, how to send intentions rather than words. She demonstrated by approaching a nervous rabbit, kneeling slowly, projecting safety and calm until the creature hopped close enough to sniff her outstretched hand. Predator smell on you, the rabbit observed, but predator heart not in you, strange human. Zyla's laugh was silent, but Bram could see it in her shaking shoulders, in the way she covered her mouth with her hand. She'd been called strange her entire life as an insult. Hearing it from a rabbit as simple observation seemed to delight her. Bram tried with a fox that emerged from the underbrush, curious about the unusual humans in its territory. At first his attempts at communication were clumsy, like shouting when he should whisper. But gradually he found the rhythm of it, the way to make his intentions felt rather than heard. You're new at this, the fox said, amused. Baby listener, cute. Did that fox just call me cute? Bram muttered, and Zyla's silent laughter intensified. They sat together against a fallen log as dawn approached, wrapped in Bram's cloak against the cold, surrounded by the constant murmur of the waking forest. Zyla leaned against his shoulder, comfortable in a way she'd never been with another person, and Bram felt something shift in his chest. You're the first person who's ever truly seen me, he said quietly. Not Omega, not servant. Not invisible, just me. Zyla pulled back to look at him, her ice blue eyes luminous in the pre-dawn light. She took his face in both hands, holding his gaze with an intensity that made his breath catch. Then she touched her forehead to his, and he felt it, a wave of emotion, of understanding, transmitted not through words, but through that deeper channel listeners shared. She saw him, all of him, the loneliness, the secret love he'd carried, the fear that he'd never be worthy of anything more than the ground he kept. And she wasn't running. She was here, choosing to stay, showing him without words that worth had nothing to do with rank or voice or what the pack deemed valuable. I don't deserve you, Bram whispered. I'm nobody, just an Omega who talks to plants and animals. Zyla shook her head firmly. She pointed to his heart, then to hers, then made a gesture like roots intertwining, growing together, inseparable. We're the same, Bram translated, his voice rough. That's what you're saying. We're both listeners, both outcasts, both worth exactly what we choose to believe we're worth. She nodded, and then, tentatively, giving him every chance to pull away, she kissed him. It was soft and brief and tasted like pine needles and hope, and it rewrote every belief Bram had ever held about what someone like him was allowed to want. When they pulled apart, both of them were shaking, not from cold, but from the enormity of what they'd just acknowledged. In Krell's pack, Omegas didn't pursue anyone, certainly not the Alpha's condemned daughter. But they weren't in Krell's pack anymore, not really. They were in the forest, among the old voices, and here different rules applied. "We need to go back before the morning patrol," Bram said reluctantly. "But tonight, we'll come again, we'll practice more." They made their way back through the lightning forest, but before they reached the compound's edge, Zyla grabbed Bram's arm. She pointed toward the pack house, her expression alarmed. Bram listened, not with his ears but with his listener sense, and heard the raised voices, the hurried footsteps. Krell was awake and he was furious. The cell check had revealed Zyla missing. "He's searching for you," Bram said, his mind racing. "We need to hide you better." But as they approached the servants' gate, they found it wasn't unguarded. A small figure stood in the shadows, Marcus's daughter, a young Omega named Sira who worked in the kitchens. She should have reported them immediately. Instead, she stepped forward and pressed a bundle into Bram's hands. "Food," she whispered. "Enough for 3 days, and this." A key. "Storage shed behind the healer's cottage. No one uses it. There's a cellar hidden entrance under the floorboards." "Why are you helping us?" Bram asked, stunned. Sira glanced at Zyla, her eyes bright with something between awe and determination. "Because she survived the bear pit. Because the beasts protected her instead of killing her. And because if the Alpha wants her dead that badly, maybe she's exactly what this pack needs." She squeezed Zyla's hand. "You're not alone. There are others like us who are tired of being invisible." She disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness before they could respond, leaving Bram and Zyla staring at each other in shock. The resistance had begun, not with warriors or grand declarations, but with small kindnesses from those the pack had spent generations ignoring. The Omegas, the servants, the ones who kept everything running while being told they didn't matter. They were listening now, and they'd decided whose side they were on. The hidden cellar beneath the healer's storage shed became a sanctuary. Word spread through the pack's lowest ranks in whispers and careful glances, passed between servants in the kitchens, between groundskeepers in the gardens, between Omegas who'd learned long ago how to communicate without being overheard by their betters. The Silent One survived. The bears protected her. She's still here, still alive. Within 3 days, Sira brought others. First came Tomas, an Omega stable hand with a scarred face, 3 jagged lines across his cheek from when he'd spoken out of turn 5 years ago. Krell had done it himself, claws extended, to teach the lesson that Omegas existed to serve, not to question. "I heard she can talk to animals," Tomas said, crouching in the cellar's dim light. His voice was hoarse, damaged from the same attack that had scarred his face. "Is it true?" Zyla nodded and gestured for Bram to speak for her. "She's a listener," Bram explained, the words coming easier now. "An ancient gift. She hears everything: animals, earth, the voices that existed before packs decided only alphas deserved to be heard." "And you," Tomas looked at Bram with new interest. "You're Omega, but you speak for her. You can hear them too." "I'm learning. She woke the gift in me." Bram glanced at Zyla, saw the slight smile playing at her lips. "We're both listeners, the first in 200 years. Tomas touched his scars reverently. "The old magic. My grandmother used to tell stories about the time before, when the pack listened to the earth instead of just taking from it. The elders said she was senile, making up fairy tales, but it was real." "It was real," Bram confirmed. "And Krell knows it. That's why he wants Zyla dead. Not because she's weak, but because she's everything he's not. She leads by understanding, not by fear." More came each night. Sira brought Lena, a young wolf who'd been assigned to Omega status despite her warrior bloodline, simply because she'd refused Krell's son's advances. There was Marcus's nephew, Finn, who'd been beaten for suggesting the pack take in refugee cubs from a neighboring territory. And Kira, the most surprising addition, a former elite warrior who'd been exiled 3 years ago for refusing to kill cubs from a rival pack. Krell said it was necessary, Kira explained, her voice hard with old anger. She was lean and scarred, with eyes that had seen too much violence. Wipe out the bloodline, ensure they never seek revenge, but they were Bobbies, 3 months old, barely weaned. She looked at Zyla with fierce intensity. I told him I wouldn't do it. He stripped my rank and cast me out. I've been living on the borders ever since, hunting alone, surviving on scraps. Why come back now? Bram asked. Because I heard the impossible happened. A girl survived the bear pit. The beasts chose her over their own hunger. Kira knelt before Zyla, her warrior's pride bent but not broken. If the animals recognize you as worthy, then so do I. Tell me how to serve. Zyla reached out and touched Kira's scarred hands, and Bram watched the exchange that happened in that moment. A communication deeper than words, a recognition of shared pain and shared purpose. When Zyla released her, Kira's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She says you already serve by refusing to compromise your humanity, Bram translated. She says your refusal to kill those cubs saved more than their lives. It saved your soul. The gatherings grew. 10 wolves became 15, then 20. They came in the dead hours before dawn, slipping through shadows, avoiding patrols with the skill of people who'd spent lifetimes being invisible. They came bearing stories of Krell's cruelty, of the pack's rot beneath its polished surface. A healer told of being forced to withhold treatment from an Omega who displeased the Alpha, watching him die slowly when simple herbs could have saved him. A merchant described watching Krell steal his profits, calling it tribute, while his children went hungry. A young mother spoke of her daughter being assigned Omega status at birth simply because she'd been born small, her fate decided before she could prove her worth. Through it all, Zyla listened, really listened, in the way only a listener could. And then, with Bram as her voice, she shared what the earth had told her. The land is sick, Bram translated, his voice carrying Zyla's certainty. Not the trees or the water, but the bond between pack and earth. We've taken without giving back. We've dominated without respecting. We've valued strength over wisdom, violence over understanding. The old ways maintained balance. Listeners ensured the pack remembered it was part of nature, not separate from it. Can the balance be restored? Lena asked. Zyla placed her hand on the cellar's dirt floor, closing her eyes. When she looked up, her expression was both hopeful and grave. She made a series of gestures that Bram had learned to read. Yes, he said, but not while Krell leads. His rule is built on fear and domination. He sees the earth as something to conquer, animals as lesser beings, Omegas as servants. Everything is hierarchy, and he sits at the top. A listener threatens that entire structure by saying some voices matter more than rank, that truth exists outside his authority. So what do we do? Tomas leaned forward. We can't fight him, he'd slaughter us. We don't fight, Kira said slowly, understanding dawning in her scarred face. We undermine. We exist. Every day Zyla lives is proof his authority isn't absolute. Every one of us who follows her is a crack in his foundation. Zyla nodded enthusiastically, then gestured more. She says change doesn't come from violence, Bram translated. It comes from enough people deciding the old way isn't acceptable anymore. We don't need to defeat Krell in combat. We need to make the pack see there's another option. A silent queen, Sira whispered. That's what they're calling you in the kitchens, the queen who leads without words. The name spread like wildfire through the gathered wolves, kindling hope in places that had forgotten what hope felt like. For the first time in years, some in their entire lives, these dismissed, abused, invisible wolves believed things could be different. But hope, like fire, created light that could be seen from far away. Krell noticed the changes first in small ways. Omegas who usually flinched when he passed now held their ground, their eyes lowered but their postures less defeated. Servants whispered in corners and fell silent when he approached, but not with the usual fear, with something else. Something that looked almost like defiance. His spies reported strange movements in the night, wolves gathering where they shouldn't. The groundskeeper's cottage occupied when it should be empty, And always, always, the whispers about the girl who should be dead. He set the trap with cold efficiency. Let word slip through a carefully chosen source, a young Omega who'd recently been promoted to Beta rank, hungry to prove his loyalty, that Zyla would be pardoned if she turned herself in. That Krell had reconsidered, that perhaps the bear pit had been too harsh. It was an obvious lie, but Krell was counting on desperation, on the hope that made people stupid. He didn't expect Zyla to come herself. He expected her followers to discuss it, to argue about whether to trust him, to reveal their gathering place through their debate. On the third night after spreading the rumor, Krell's warriors surrounded the healer's storage shed. Inside the cellar, 20 wolves went silent as they heard the footsteps above. Heavy, deliberate, too many to be a coincidence. Bram's blood turned to ice. He looked at Zyla, saw the same realization in her eyes. They'd been found. The cellar's entrance exploded inward with a crash of splintering wood. Warriors poured through the opening like water through a broken dam, their eyes gleaming with the anticipation of violence sanctioned by their alpha. The 20 wolves gathered below had nowhere to run, no weapons, no way to fight back against trained fighters who outnumbered them 2-1. "Don't resist," Kira commanded, her warrior instincts taking over even in defeat. "They're looking for an excuse to kill us." The arrests were brutal but efficient. Warriors hauled the gathered wolves up through the broken entrance, binding their hands with rough rope, shoving them into lines. Sira was crying silently. Tomas kept his scarred face carefully blank. Lena fought until a warrior's fist caught her jaw and sent her sprawling. But Krell's men didn't find Zyla. Bram had hidden her behind a false wall at the first sound of footsteps above, a space barely large enough for her slender frame. She watched through a crack as her followers were taken, her ice-blue eyes wide with horror and helplessness. Bram stood with the captured, his heart hammering. If they searched thoroughly, they'd find her. His only hope was that Krell wanted prisoners to interrogate, not a thorough investigation of empty cellars. They were dragged to the pack house's lower dungeons, the same stone cells where Zyla had spent her last night before the bear pit. Krell was waiting, massive and terrible in the torchlight, his expression carved from cold satisfaction. "Conspirators," he said, his voice echoing off stone walls. "Harboring a condemned criminal, plotting sedition, these are capital offenses." He walked slowly down the line of captured wolves, studying each face. "But I am not without mercy. Tell me where the girl is hiding and I'll spare your lives, refuse, and you'll join her in the pit." Silence. 20 wolves, terrified and bound, said nothing. Krell's expression darkened. "Very well, we'll do this the hard way." The torture started with Finn, Marcus's nephew. They took him to a separate cell where his screams could be heard by everyone else, a psychological weapon as much as physical punishment. It lasted an hour, an eternity measured in agony, before Finn's voice broke into sobbing. But he didn't talk. They tried Lena next, then Sira. Each time, the sounds of pain echoed through the dungeon, each time the captives held their silence. Bram sat in his cell with his hands clenched so tight his nails drew blood, listening to people being hurt because of him, because of Zyla, because they dared to believe something better was possible. On the fourth prisoner, a young Omega named Reed who worked in the laundries, Krell's patience broke. "Enough," he snarled. "We're wasting time. Burn down the groundskeeper's cottage. If she's there, we'll find her body in the ashes. If not, we'll know someone is still hiding her." "No," Reed's voice cracked, high and desperate. "No, please, don't burn it. She's not there anymore. He choked on a sob. "She's in the old cottage, the one past the eastern border. I saw the groundskeeper taking supplies there yesterday." Bram's heart stopped. The old cottage was where he'd planned to move Zyla next, but they hadn't gone yet. Reed was lying, trying to buy time, sending Krell's men on a false trail. But Krell would figure it out eventually, and when he did, he'd come back to the groundskeeper's cottage with fire and fury. "Good," Krell purred. "See, cooperation is so much simpler." He gestured to his warriors. "Take 20 men, surround the old cottage. If she runs, kill her. I want this ended today." As soon as the warriors left, Bram started working at his cell's lock. The mechanism was old, simple, designed to hold prisoners too broken or terrified to resist. But Bram had maintained these cells for years. He knew their weaknesses. A bent nail from his pocket, hands steadied by desperate purpose, and the lock clicked open. He had perhaps 30 minutes before Krell's men realized they'd been sent to an empty cottage. 30 minutes to get Zyla to safety, though he had no idea where safety even existed anymore. He ran through the awakening compound, no longer caring about stealth. The groundskeeper's cottage door hung open. He'd forgotten to lock it in the chaos of the arrest. Inside, everything looked untouched. Normal, a perfect lie. "Zyla," he called, pulling aside the rug that covered the cellar entrance. "We have to go now." She emerged from her hiding space, pale and shaking. She'd heard everything from her cramped refuge, the arrests, the torture, Reed's desperate lie. Her eyes asked the question her voice couldn't. How many people would suffer because of her? "Don't," Bram said, reading her expression. "Don't you dare blame yourself for Krell's cruelty. He did this. He's always done this. You just gave people hope that they could survive it." She touched his face gently, then pointed toward the door. They had to run. But they were too late. Krell stood in the doorway, flanked by 6 warriors. His smile was terrible in its triumph. "The old cottage was empty," he said conversationally. "Which made me think, where would a clever little Omega hide something precious? Then I remembered, rats always return to their nests." Bram stepped in front of Zyla, his body a useless shield against an alpha who could snap him like kindling. "She's innocent. She's done nothing wrong." "She exists," Krell said. "That's crime enough." He moved forward, and Bram did the only thing he could think of. He lunged. It was pathetic, really. An Omega groundskeeper attacking an alpha. The fight lasted perhaps 5 seconds before Krell's fist caught Bram's ribs and something cracked. The second blow caught his face, splitting his lip, filling his mouth with blood. The third drove him to the floor, gasping, unable to see through the pain. "Stop!" Zyla's silence broke in the only way it could. She threw herself between them, her hands raised in surrender, her eyes pleading. "Take me. Leave him alone, please." Krell grabbed her by the silver hair and hauled her up. "You've poisoned my pack with your weakness," he snarled into her face. "Turned loyal wolves into conspirators, made them believe your freakish survival meant something." He threw her toward his warriors, who caught her roughly. "Trial by combat, tomorrow at noon. I will kill you myself, and everyone will watch what happens to those who challenge my authority." "No trial." Bram gasped through broken ribs. "She's innocent." "She breathes. That's guilt enough." Krell kicked Bram once more for good measure, his boot connecting with already broken ribs. "Take her to the cells. Take him to the healers. I want him alive to watch her die." They dragged Zyla away. She didn't fight, didn't struggle, just kept her eyes on Bram's broken form until the warriors pulled her around a corner and out of sight. Bram tried to stand, tried to follow, but his body wouldn't obey. He tasted copper and defeat, felt consciousness slipping away. The last thing he heard before darkness took him was a sound that made his blood run cold. Roaring, deep and primal and endless, coming from the direction of the bear pit. The bears had sensed Zyla's distress, and they were calling for her, their voices shaking the very foundations of the pack house. All 5 of them, roaring as one, refusing to be silent while their listener suffered. In the medical ward, they set Bram's ribs and cleaned his wounds while he drifted in and out of consciousness. Every time he surfaced, he heard it, the bear's continuous roar, a sound that wouldn't stop, that kept the entire pack awake and on edge. "She is ours," the matriarch's voice whispered in his mind, somehow reaching him even through the fog of pain. "They harm her, they answer to us. Tell her we wait. Tell her we remember." "I will," Bram whispered to the darkness. "I'll tell her." If he lived long enough, if either of them survived tomorrow. Outside, the bears roared on, and the pack began to wonder if perhaps their alpha had made a terrible mistake. The great arena had been built for spectacle, for the pack to witness justice delivered with teeth and claws. Circular stone tiers rose 30 feet high, able to hold every member of the 300-strong pack with room to spare. By noon, every seat was filled. Warriors in the front rows, eager for blood. Merchants and craftsmen in the middle, uncomfortable but obedient. Omegas and servants in the back, their faces carefully blank. Krell stood at the arena's center in his full alpha form, and he was magnificent in the way that apex predators are magnificent, beautiful and terrible and utterly without mercy. His wolf form was massive, easily twice the size of a normal shifted wolf, with fur so black it seemed to absorb light. Scars crisscrossed his flanks, each one a testament to battles won, to challengers defeated. His eyes burned yellow with dominance, and the very air around him seemed to shimmer with barely contained power. Across from him, Zyla looked impossibly small. They'd stripped her of the rough servant's clothes she'd worn in hiding and dressed her in a simple white shift, traditional garb for the condemned, meant to show blood clearly when it was spilled. Her silver hair hung loose down her back, catching the midday sun like starlight. Her ice-blue eyes were steady, unafraid. She didn't look like a warrior preparing for combat. She looked like a sacrifice waiting for the knife. In the medical section, Bram sat with bandaged ribs and a face purple with bruising. The healers had tried to make him stay in bed, but he'd threatened to crawl to the arena if they didn't help him walk. Kira stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, ready to catch him if he collapsed. Krell's voice boomed across the arena, amplified by acoustics designed for exactly this purpose. This creature has poisoned our pack with false hope and dangerous fantasies. She has turned loyal wolves against their alpha, spread sedition among the weak-minded, and violated the sacred law that demands the unfit be culled. He stalked closer to Zyla, his massive wolf form radiating menace. She survived the bear pit through animal confusion, nothing more. But there will be no confusion today. Today, I will personally purge this weakness from our bloodline. The pack roared its approval, though Bram noticed how many voices were muted, how many faces in the Omega section remained silent. The trial begins, Beta Marcus announced, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. May the strong prevail. Krell charged. He moved with the speed and power that had made him alpha, a blur of black fur and flashing teeth. The distance between them closed in seconds. Zyla didn't run. She didn't even flinch. She simply dropped to her knees and pressed both palms flat against the arena's sand-covered floor. The earth responded. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a tremor, a ripple that spread outward from where Zyla knelt. But Krell felt it. His charge faltered for just a moment, confusion crossing his wolf's face. Then the tremor grew stronger and stronger still, until the entire arena was shaking. The bear pit was a quarter-mile from the arena, but the sound carried clearly, the shriek of tearing metal, the crash of cage doors exploding outward. The bears had been working at their locks for 3 days, using their massive strength methodically, patiently, waiting for this moment. They came like thunder made flesh. 5 enormous bears charging across the compound, scattering wolves who were too shocked to fight back. The matriarch led them, her eyes fixed on the arena where her listener knelt in danger. Behind her came the others, scarred and savage and absolutely determined. The pack erupted into chaos. Wolves scattered from the bears' path. Warriors reached for weapons that weren't there. No one brought arms to trials by combat. Beta Marcus shouted orders that no one followed. And Bram, despite his broken ribs, despite the healers grabbing at him, ran. He vaulted the barrier separating the medical section from the arena floor, landing badly and nearly blacking out from the pain. But he kept moving, kept running toward Zyla, because if she was going to die, he would die beside her. That was what love meant. Behind him, something extraordinary happened. Sira jumped the barrier, then Tomas, then Lena despite her bruised jaw, then Finn despite the burns on his arms from his torture. One by one, the wolves who'd gathered in the cellar, who'd listened to Zyla's message, who'd decided that maybe, just maybe, things could be different, they all ran into the arena. Kira was among them, her warrior's body moving with lethal grace despite her exile. She positioned herself between Krell and Zyla, weaponless but unbowed. "You want her," she called to the alpha. "You go through all of us first." The bears arrived like an avalanche. The matriarch didn't slow, didn't hesitate. She intercepted Krell's second charge with a roar that shook the stone tiers, her massive body colliding with his wolf form and sending them both rolling. The other bears fanned out, creating a protective perimeter around Xyla and the gathered rebels. Krell recovered fast, his warrior's instincts taking over. He lunged at the matriarch, teeth flashing, going for her throat. But she was battle-scarred and cunning, had survived starvation and abuse and 200 years of pack cruelty. She twisted, caught his shoulder in her jaws, and flung him aside like he weighed nothing. "Stand down," Krell roared, shifting back to human form, blood streaming from the wound on his shoulder. "All of you, this is treason. This is." Enough. The word didn't come from any throat. It simply existed, pressed into every mind in the arena simultaneously. Xyla's voice, not spoken but felt, transmitted through the gift that made her what she was. She rose to her feet, still small, still fragile-looking in her white shift. But something had changed. The trembling in the earth grew stronger. The sky darkened as birds, hundreds of them, converged on the arena, perching on the stone tiers, watching with intelligent eyes. From the forest came deer, foxes, wolves that belonged to no pack. They gathered at the arena's edges, drawn by something older than law, older than hierarchy. Xyla raised one hand, and everything stopped. Krell froze mid-movement. The warriors reaching for weapons found their hands wouldn't obey. The entire pack felt it, a pressure, a presence, something vast and ancient that had been sleeping beneath the earth and had finally awakened. "You built your power on silence," Xyla's voiceless voice said, and everyone heard it. "On making others small so you could feel large. On crushing differences so you could pretend strength has only one form." The earth beneath the arena cracked. Not violently, not dangerously, but deliberately. Green shoots pushed through stone and sand, grass, flowers, saplings that shouldn't exist in this barren place. Life reclaiming what had been dedicated to death. "I am not your weakness," Xyla continued, her ice-blue eyes fixed on Krell. "I am what you tried to erase. I am the voice you silenced. I am the proof that power comes in forms you refuse to recognize." Animals surrounded the arena now, predator and prey standing side by side, united by something deeper than food chains or survival instincts. The pack felt it too, omega wolves standing straighter, finding courage they'd forgotten they possessed. Mid-rank wolves questioning why they'd ever accepted this hierarchy as natural. Even some warriors looked uncertain, seeing their alpha bleed and recognizing for the first time that invincibility was just another lie. You wanted trial by combat, Xyla's presence pressed into their minds. So here is your trial, not wolf against girl, but the old way against the new, nature against domination, truth against the silence you forced on those who threatened your power. The matriarch moved to stand beside Xyla, her massive head level with the girl's shoulder. The other bears flanked them. Bram, Kira, Sira, Tomas, all the rebels formed a living barrier. And slowly, incrementally, other wolves began to move. An omega from the back rose, a healer who'd been forced to withhold treatment, a merchant tired of paying tribute, a mother who didn't want her daughter's fate decided at birth. They didn't speak. They simply stood with Xyla, and their presence was louder than any words. Krell looked around his arena and saw his authority crumbling, saw the pack fracturing before his eyes, saw that he could kill Xyla, probably still could, even wounded, but it wouldn't matter. The crack in his foundation had become a chasm, and enough wolves had decided to jump. "This isn't over," he snarled, blood dripping from his shoulder. Xyla smiled. It was small and sad and absolutely certain. "Yes," her voiceless voice said, "it is." The silence after Xyla's declaration stretched like a held breath. 300 wolves stood frozen in the arena, caught between the alpha they'd always known and the impossible girl who just stopped the earth itself from swallowing them whole. Even Krell seemed uncertain, his warrior's instincts warring with the recognition that he'd lost something more fundamental than a fight. Beta Marcus stepped forward, his practical mind already working through implications. "Alpha Krell has been bested in trial by combat," he announced, his voice carrying across the arena. "By ancient law." "I wasn't bested by her," Krell snarled, clutching his wounded shoulder. I was attacked by animals, by traitors, by every voice you silenced. Xyla's presence filled their minds again, gentler now but no less certain. By everyone you made invisible. By the earth you treated as property instead of partner. She walked toward Krell, still small in her white shift, still looking nothing like a warrior. But everyone could feel the power radiating from her now, not dominance, but something older. Connection, understanding, the patient strength of roots breaking through stone simply by growing. When she reached Krell, she placed one hand over the wound the matriarch had given him. He flinched back, but she persisted, and where her palm touched his bloodied shoulder, green light flickered. The bleeding slowed. The torn flesh began to knit. Not completely, the scar would remain, a permanent reminder, but enough that he wouldn't die from it. I could kill you. Xyla's voice was soft in their minds. The bears would do it gladly. The earth itself would swallow you if I asked. But that would make me you, and I didn't survive your cruelty just to become it. Mercy, Krell spat the word like poison. You think mercy makes you strong. I think mercy makes me human, Xyla responded. Something you forgot how to be. She turned to address the entire pack, her voiceless voice reaching every mind. He will leave. Today, alive. With supplies for the journey and safe passage to the border. Because we are not him. We do not kill those who threaten us simply because we can. You're exiling me. Krell's laugh was bitter and broken. I built this pack, I made it strong. You made it afraid, Xyla corrected. There's a difference. Beta Marcus nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in mercy that looked like weakness but was actually strength. The Alpha has been defeated. He will be exiled with honor, as befits his former rank. The pack must now choose new leadership. The traditional process involved combat trials, tests of strength, demonstrations of dominance. But as the pack looked at the cracked earth, the gathered animals, the girl who'd stopped a battle with a thought, they realized the old ways didn't apply anymore. Bram stepped forward, wincing as his broken ribs protested. But his voice was steady when he spoke, translating not just for Xyla, but for every silent, dismissed, invisible member of the pack who'd never been allowed to speak before. The bears say she is chosen, he called out, his words carrying across the stone tiers. They recognized what she was before any of us did. They starved themselves to protect her because they knew she is listener. The first in 5 generations, the return of something we thought we'd destroyed. He gestured to the animals surrounding the arena, to the green growing through stone, to the way reality itself seemed to bend around Xyla's presence. The land says she is worthy. It responds to her. It grows for her. It recognizes her as kin in a way it never recognized Krell's dominance. Bram's eyes swept across the gathered pack, meeting the gazes of Omega and Warrior alike. And I say she is the only one who has ever truly seen us, all of us, not just the strong or the loud or the ones who fit into neat categories. She sees the Omega who was scarred for speaking, the warrior who was exiled for showing mercy, the healer who was forced to let patients die. She sees us and she says we matter, not because of our rank or our strength, but because we exist, because we're pack. His voice broke slightly on the last word, and Xyla moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. She can't speak, Bram continued. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we've spent too long listening only to the loudest voices and missing the truth underneath. Maybe it's time for a different kind of alpha, one who leads by understanding instead of domination, one who listens instead of commands. Sira was the first to kneel. The young Omega who'd brought food to the cellar, who'd risked everything to help hide Xyla, dropped to one knee in the sand and bowed her head. My alpha, she said quietly. Tomas knelt beside her, his scarred face tilted up toward Xyla with something like hope. My alpha. One by one, the Omegas in the back rows descended to the arena floor and knelt. 20, 30, 40 wolves who'd spent their lives being told they didn't matter, claiming their voices by bowing to someone who finally heard them. The mid-rank wolves came next, merchants tired of paying tribute, healers tired of being overruled by warriors, craftsmen who'd watched their Omega children be dismissed before they could prove their worth. They knelt not out of fear, but out of recognition that maybe, just maybe, this strange, silent girl understood something Krell never had. The warriors were last, and their submission came hardest. They'd built their identities on strength, on dominance, on the hierarchy that put them near the top. Kneeling to an Omega, to a girl who couldn't shift, to someone who'd never won a fight, it violated everything they thought they knew about power. But Kira knelt, her warrior's pride intact even as she bowed. "I followed Krell because he was strong," she said. "I follow you because you're right." And once Kira knelt, others followed. Not all, some warriors left with Krell, unable to accept this new order. But enough stayed. Enough decided that maybe strength came in forms they'd never learned to recognize. Beta Marcus was the last to kneel, his practical mind already reorganizing pack structure around this impossible new reality. "Alpha Xyla," he said formally. "The Silent Queen, may your reign be long and your wisdom deep." Xyla looked out over her kneeling pack, and for the first time since her mother died, she cried. Not from pain or fear, but from relief, from recognition, from the overwhelming knowledge that she was no longer alone. "Rise," her voice filled their minds, gentle as spring rain. "Please, I don't want you on your knees, I want you as partners, as pack, as equals who choose to work together instead of a hierarchy enforced by fear." The changes came swiftly after that. Xyla's first act as Alpha was ordering the bear pit demolished. The ancient stones were pulled down, the cages destroyed, the ground where so many had died blessed and planted with new growth. The bears were offered freedom, but they chose to stay, making their den in the forest nearby where they could watch over their listener. Bram became her voice, not servant but equal partner. Where she felt and understood, he translated and spoke. Where she sensed the earth's wisdom, he put it into words the pack could follow. They worked as one, two halves of the same gift, two listeners who'd found each other against impossible odds. Their relationship became official, not through any ceremony, but through simple recognition. They moved into the Alpha's residence together, and no one questioned it. They made decisions side by side, and the pack learned to value both the silent wisdom and the spoken word. They loved each other openly, and it stopped being scandalous that an Omega and the Alpha's daughter, now Alpha herself, had chosen each other. "Two listeners," the matriarch observed one evening when they visited her den. "The old stories said they always came in pairs, one to hear the earth, one to speak for it. You are complete." The pack structure shifted from rigid hierarchy to something more organic. Omegas were no longer automatically relegated to service. They were evaluated as individuals, their gifts and interests determining their roles. Some remained servants by choice, finding satisfaction in the work. Others became advisors, healers, teachers. Sira eventually became head of the newly formed Council of Voices, where any pack member could bring concerns without fear of punishment. Warriors remained, but their role changed. No longer were they enforcers of the Alpha's will. They became protectors in the truest sense, guardians of the weak, defenders of pack law that now included mercy and understanding alongside strength. The cruelest traditions ended. No more executions for speaking out of turn. No more permanent assignments based on birth status. No more tolerance for those who used rank as license to abuse. And slowly, wolves from other packs began to arrive at their borders. Refugees from Alphas like Krell, fleeing cruelty, seeking the impossible story they'd heard. A pack led by a silent queen who listened to every voice, even the ones without sound. On a clear spring morning 6 months after her ascension, Xyla stood at the edge of what had been the bear pit. Grass grew thick there now, and wildflowers. Bram stood beside her, his ribs healed, his hand warm in hers. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Taking on all this responsibility, you could have just run when you had the chance." Xyla turned to him, her ice blue eyes bright with certainty. She placed his hand over her heart, then hers over his, in the gesture that had become their private language. "With you I am home," her presence whispered in his mind. "With this pack I am purpose. With this gift I am exactly who I was always meant to be. No regrets, only gratitude." She kissed him then, soft and sure, while the matriarch watched from the forest's edge and the pack went about their daily work, learning slowly how to be something new. The silent queen had found her voice, and it was louder than any roar. 5 years changed everything and nothing. The compound still stood on the same land, the forest still surrounded it on 3 sides, the mountains still rose in the distance. But everything within those borders had transformed so completely that wolves who'd known it under Krell's rule barely recognized it when they returned to visit. The pack house no longer looked like a fortress. Vines grew up its stone walls now, flowering in spring, providing shade in summer. The gardens that had once been rigidly manicured for show now grew wild and purposeful, herbs for the healers, vegetables for the kitchens, flowers because beauty mattered as much as function. The Bear Pit's former location was marked by a memorial grove where pack members came to remember those who died there, to ensure that particular cruelty was never forgotten or repeated. The pack itself had grown to nearly 500, more than doubling in size. But these weren't conquests or forced absorptions. They were refugees, outcasts, the broken pieces other packs had discarded. Word had spread through the territories about the silent queen who led without speaking, who valued listening over dominance, who'd built something unprecedented, a sanctuary where difference wasn't just tolerated but celebrated. There were wolves who couldn't shift, whose human forms were their only forms, and they worked as teachers, artists, record keepers. There were Omegas in leadership positions. Sira now headed the Council of Voices. Tomas ran the expanded stables where he gentled horses with the same patience he'd learned surviving Krell's cruelty. There were healers like old Marcus, who'd watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction, seeing the pack become what he'd always hoped it could be. And there were 3 other listeners. They'd arrived over the years, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had activated Bram's dormant gift. A teenage boy from the Northern Territories who heard trees speaking. An elderly woman who'd hidden her ability for 60 years, believing she was mad. A young mother whose infant daughter had been born with the gift, and who'd fled before her old pack could call it a curse. Zyla worked with them all, teaching them to embrace what they were, to develop gifts that had been suppressed or misunderstood. The pack learned to value their insights, crop rotations planned according to what the earth needed, conflicts resolved through understanding deeper motivations, harmony between pack and nature that had been missing for generations. New traditions had emerged to replace the cruel ones. Every full moon, the pack gathered for listening circles where anyone could speak or share or simply sit in community. No hierarchy, no judgment, just presence. The seasonal festivals now honored the earth's cycles, planting ceremonies in spring, gratitude celebrations after harvest, winter solstice gatherings, where they remembered that even the darkest times eventually yielded to light. The Alpha's residence had become something between a home and a community center. Zyla and Bram lived there, but the doors were always open. Pack members brought disputes to be mediated, children came for lessons, the lonely came for company. It was never quite quiet, never quite private, and neither of them would have wanted it any other way. They'd built a family too, though not in traditional ways. Over 5 years, 7 cubs had come to them, abandoned by parents who fled, orphaned by disasters, rejected by birth packs for being defective in various ways. There was Mika, born deaf, who communicated in the sign language Zyla had learned and taught to the entire pack. There was Reed, who had seizures and had been called cursed by his old alpha. There was tiny Senna, found half-starved on the borders, who still hoarded food under her bed because scarcity had been all she'd known. They were broken pieces that Zyla and Bram had gathered and treasured, showing them through action that being different wasn't the same as being less. On quiet evenings, the Alpha's residence overflowed with chaos, children's laughter, Bram's patient explanations of homework, Zyla's silent presence anchoring them all with the steady certainty that here, they were safe. Here, they were loved. Here, they belonged. It was during one of those chaotic evenings that the message came. A scout had found a child at the eastern border, a girl, maybe 9 years old, alone and terrified. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't shift, just stood frozen at the boundary line like she was waiting for permission to exist. Zyla went immediately, Bram beside her, the matriarch padding along because the bear still followed her listener everywhere, a guardian and friend. They found the girl exactly as described, small and hollow-eyed, with tangled dark hair and clothes that hung off her too thin frame. She watched them approach with the wariness of an animal that's been hurt too many times. Zyla knelt in the grass, making herself smaller, less threatening. She didn't try to speak, didn't reach out, just waited with the infinite patience she'd learned from the earth itself. Bram stood back, giving them space, understanding that this moment needed Zyla's silent presence more than his words. The girl's eyes fixed on Zyla with something like recognition. Then, hesitantly, she made a gesture, hand to her throat, shaking her head. The universal sign for I cannot speak. Zyla smiled and repeated the gesture, then placed her hand over her heart. Neither can I, the gesture said, and I am Alpha here. The girl's eyes widened. She made another gesture, this one asking a question Bram couldn't interpret, but Zyla clearly understood. Zyla nodded and gestured to the forest around them, to the matriarch, to the pack borders visible in the distance. Yes, her movements said, they all listen. They all hear, not with words but with something deeper. The girl's face crumpled. She'd been holding herself together through sheer will, and permission to break was all it took. She collapsed into Zyla's arms, sobbing without sound, shaking with relief and exhaustion and the overwhelming sensation of finally being understood. Zyla held her while she cried, one hand stroking her tangled hair, the other pressed against her back right over her heart. Bram watched his mate work the same magic she'd worked on him 5 years ago. The magic of being seen, of being valued, of being told through presence rather than words that you are not broken. You are not wrong. You are exactly who you were meant to be. When the girl's tears finally subsided, Zyla pulled back enough to look into her eyes. She made a series of gestures, and Bram translated aloud for the gathered scouts. You're not broken. You're just listening to voices others cannot hear. You're a listener like me, and here, that makes you sacred. The girl nodded, understanding more from Zyla's presence than from Bram's words. She made a tentative gesture toward the pack lands, asking permission. You're already home, Zyla's expression said. You were home the moment you chose to trust us. They walked back together, Zyla's hand gentle on the girl's shoulder, the matriarch providing a warm, furry escort. As they approached the pack house, the other children spilled out to greet them, Mika signing rapidly, Reed bouncing with excitement, Senna hanging back shyly but curious. 7 became 8, and the family grew again as it always did when someone needed belonging. That evening, after the new girl had been fed and bathed and tucked into a bed in the children's wing, Zyla stood on the Alpha residence's balcony and looked out over her pack. Lights glowed in windows. Laughter drifted from the communal hall where evening gatherings were always welcome. In the distance, she could sense the matriarch and her bears settling in for the night, their presence a constant comfort. Bram joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. Another one saved, he murmured. Another one found, Zyla corrected in his mind. She was never lost, just waiting for someone to recognize what she was. Like you were. Like we both were. She turned in his arms, her ice-blue eyes reflecting the starlight. Everyone here was waiting. The bears waited for a listener. I waited for someone who could hear them too. The Omegas waited for a leader who saw their worth. The outcasts waited for sanctuary. We were all just waiting for permission to be ourselves. And now we're becoming what we were always meant to be. She gestured to the thriving pack below, to the children sleeping safely in their beds, to the forest that hummed with life and balance. Not perfect, but healing. Not finished, but growing. In the memorial grove, fireflies danced above the flowers. In the communal hall, someone started singing and others joined in. In the children's wing, the new girl finally slept without fear, knowing that tomorrow she'd wake in a place where silence was understood, where difference was honored, where being unable to speak with words didn't mean you had no voice. The pack threw her away because she was different. But Zyla had built a new pack for everyone the old world threw away, for the mute and the scarred, for the Omegas and the exiled, for anyone who'd ever been told they were broken and had the courage to believe they were simply different. 5 years ago, she'd stood in a bear pit waiting to die, and the beasts had chosen starvation over violence. Now she stood as their queen, surrounded by chosen family and hard-won peace, proof that the quietest voices sometimes speak the loudest truths. The silent queen looked out over her sanctuary and smiled, and the earth itself seemed to smile with her. Have you ever been silenced and found your power in the quiet? Zyla's presence whispered into the night, not to her pack, but to something larger, to every broken thing that had ever learned to grow through the cracks. Have you ever been told you were too much or not enough, and discovered that the problem was never you? Share your story, speak your silence. Know that somewhere someone hears you. And know that different has never, ever meant less. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and patient, and the silent queen kept her vigil, listening to all the voices the world had tried to silence, and loving every single one. The bears chose starvation over cruelty. The silent queen chose mercy over vengeance. And the pack learned that the voices they'd dismissed were the ones they needed most. Sometimes the people the world throws away are exactly the ones who change everything. Sometimes silence speaks louder than dominance. Sometimes being broken is just another word for becoming something new. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt unseen or unheard, if you believe in the power of choosing compassion over cruelty, subscribe and join our pack. Because everyone deserves to be listened to, especially those who speak without words. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that different doesn't mean less. Drop a comment about a time you found strength in what others called weakness. And I will see you in the next story.